December 7th, 1941, a date that would live in infamy. But for one man, a simple farmer from Nebraska who had never fired a shot in anger, it would become the day he transformed into one of the most lethal aerial gunners in American history. His name was Henry Christensen, and what he did on that first day of combat was so extraordinary, so statistically impossible, that even today military historians struggle to explain it. Before we dive into this incredible true story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we bring you the most unbelievable war stories that Hollywood couldn't even dream up. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next on this channel. Henry Christensen wasn't supposed to be a warrior. He was supposed to be tending cattle, plowing fields, and living out a quiet life in the American heartland. Born in 1921 in a small town outside of Lincoln, Nebraska, Henry grew up with dirt under his fingernails and hay in his hair. His father owned a modest farm, 200 acres of corn and wheat, and young Henry spent his childhood doing what farm boys did back then, waking before dawn, working until dusk, and dreaming of something bigger than the endless horizon of prairie grass. He was a third of 5 children, and money was always tight. The Great Depression hit his family hard, like it did everyone else, and there were nights when dinner was nothing more than beans and cornbread. But the Christensens were tough people, the kind of stock that built America from the ground up, and they never complained. They just worked harder. Henry was a good student, not brilliant, but solid. He liked history and mathematics, and his teachers said he had a natural aptitude for mechanics. When something broke on the farm, Henry was usually the one who figured out how to fix it. Tractors, pumps, threshers, you name it. If it had moving parts, Henry could diagnose the problem and get it running again. His father used to joke that Henry could hear what a machine was thinking, that he had some kind of sixth sense about how things worked. That skill, that almost supernatural understanding of mechanical systems, would save his life more times than anyone could count in the years to come. But in 1939, when Henry graduated from high school, war seemed like something that happened in faraway places to other people. Sure, there was trouble in Europe. Everyone knew that Hitler was on the move, but America wasn't involved, and most folks want to keep it that way. Henry certainly did. He had plans. Simple plans, sure, but they were his. He wanted to save up enough money to buy his own piece of land, maybe find a nice girl, settle down, raise a family. The American dream, plain and simple. But then everything changed. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Henry heard about it on the radio while he was in the barn fixing a broken fence post. At first, he thought it was one of those Orson Welles-type radio dramas, some kind of fiction meant to entertain. But as he listened, as the announcer's voice grew more frantic, more desperate, Henry realized this was real. America was under attack. Japanese planes had bombed the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, and thousands of Americans were dead or dying. Henry stood there in that barn, hammer in hand, listening to the chaos coming through that little radio speaker, and he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't excitement, not exactly. It was more like a door opening in his mind, a door he didn't know existed. He had never considered joining the military, never thought about fighting, about killing, about seeing the world beyond Nebraska's borders. But now, standing there with the smell of hay and motor oil in his nostrils, Henry Christensen made a decision that would change his life forever. He enlisted the next day. Didn't tell his parents first. Didn't think about it too much. Just walked into the recruiting office in Lincoln and signed his name on the dotted line. The recruiter, a grizzled Army sergeant with 3 stripes on his sleeve and a row of ribbons Henry didn't understand, asked him what he wanted to do. Infantry? Artillery? Henry thought about it for maybe 10 seconds and then said something that surprised even himself. He wanted to fly, not as a pilot. Mind you, Henry wasn't fool enough to think he had the education or the background for that. But as a crewman, someone who worked on the planes, someone who kept him in the air. The sergeant looked him up and down, noted his height, 5'11", his weight, 170 pounds, his strong hands and clear eyes, and nodded. 2 weeks later, Henry Christensen was on a train heading to basic training in Texas, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. Basic training was hell, but Henry expected that. What he didn't expect was how much he loved it. The physical conditioning, the discipline. the sense of purpose. It all clicked for him in a way that farming never had. He was good at following orders, good at pushing himself beyond what he thought were his limits, and his mechanical aptitude made him stand out immediately. His instructors noticed. They noticed how quickly he learned to field strip and reassemble a Browning machine gun. They noticed how he seemed to understand ballistics and trajectories without needing much explanation. They noticed that when other recruits were struggling with the technical aspects of aerial gunnery, Henry was asking questions that went 3 steps beyond what they were teaching. So when it came time to assign specialties, Henry got exactly what he wanted. He was going to be an aerial gunner, specifically a waist gunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress, the backbone of America's strategic bombing campaign. The training was intense. Henry learned everything about the .50 caliber Browning machine gun, the weapon that would become an extension of his body. He learned how to clear jams at 30,000 feet in negative 40-degree temperatures. He learned how to calculate lead and deflection angles while his target was moving at 300 miles per hour and he was moving at 200. He learned how to control his breathing, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it, how to fire in short, control bursts instead of holding down the trigger and wasting ammunition. But most importantly, he learned how to stay calm when everything around him was exploding into chaos. The instructors would scream at him, set off firecrackers near his head, shake the training platform he was standing on, anything to simulate the insanity of actual combat. And Henry, quiet farm boy Henry from Nebraska, just kept his eyes on the target and kept firing. His scores on the range were exceptional, in the top 5% of his class, but scores on a range meant nothing. The real test was coming, and it was coming fast. By mid-1942, Henry was assigned to the 306 Bombardment Group, part of the 5th Air Force operating in the Pacific Theater. The war against Japan was not going well. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military had swept the Pacific like a tidal wave, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and threatening Australia itself. American forces were desperately trying to slow down the Japanese advance, but they were outmanned, outgunned, and fighting thousands of miles from home with supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The B-17 crews were flying missions almost daily, striking at Japanese shipping, airfields, and troop concentrations, and the losses were staggering. For every 10 bombers that took off, sometimes only 6 or 7 came back. The life expectancy of an aerial gunner in the Pacific Theater was measured in weeks, not months. Henry knew this. Everyone knew this. They just didn't talk about it. Henry's first assignment was to a plane called Lucky Linda, a B-17E model that had already flown 15 missions. The crew was a mix of veterans and newcomers like Henry. The pilot was a captain from Texas named Jim Thornton, a man with a handlebar mustache and a habit of chewing tobacco even at altitude, which drove the bombardier crazy. The co-pilot was younger, a lieutenant from Ohio, who looked like he should still be in high school. The navigator was a former math teacher, quiet and methodical. The bombardier was a loudmouth from Brooklyn who never shut up, which was his way of dealing with fear. The radio operator was from Montana, taciturn and steady. The bald turret gunner was a tiny Italian kid from Philadelphia who barely weighed 130 pounds, the only size that could fit into that claustrophobic death trap, suspended underneath the fuselage. The tail gunner was a farm boy like Henry, but from Iowa, and they bonded immediately over their shared background. And then there was Henry, the new guy, assigned to the starboard waist gun position, a spot that had been occupied by 3 different gunners in Lucky Linda's previous 15 missions. 2 had been wounded badly enough to be sent home. 1 had been killed. Henry's first mission was supposed to be a milk run. That's what Captain Thornton called it. They were going to hit a Japanese airfield on the northern coast of New Guinea, drop their bombs, and get out. Intelligence said there would be minimal fighter opposition, that the Japanese had pulled most of their aircraft back to defend or bow. Intelligence was wrong. They were wrong a lot in those days. The mission was scheduled for 0600 hours, meaning the crew had to wake up at 0300 prepare. Henry barely slept the night before. He lay in his bunk listening to the sound of the jungle outside, the insects and birds, and God knew what else. Thinking about his family back in Nebraska, wondering if they were thinking about him, wondering if he would survive long enough to write them another letter. When the wake-up call came, Henry was already dressed. The pre-flight briefing was tense. The intelligence officer, a major with round glasses and a nervous habit of tapping his pencil on the map, showed them the target, the route in, the route out, the expected anti-aircraft artillery positions, everything. Then he got to the part about fighter opposition, and that's when Henry saw Captain Thornton's jaw tighten. The major said they might encounter some resistance, maybe a handful of Zeros, nothing the formation couldn't handle. Stay tight, watch each other's backs, and they'd be fine. Henry looked around the room at the other crews, some of whom had been flying combat missions for months, and he saw the skepticism in their eyes. They had heard this before. The major finished the briefing, wished them good luck, and then the chaplain said a quick prayer. Some of the men bowed their heads. Henry did too, even though he wasn't particularly religious. It just seemed like the thing to do. Walking out to Lucky Linda in the pre-dawn darkness, Henry felt his heart pounding in his chest. The ground crew had already fueled and armed the plane, and she sat there on a hard stand like a sleeping giant, her aluminum skin gleaming in the lights. Henry climbed aboard through the waist door, the metal cold under his hands, and made his way to his position. The .50 caliber Browning was already mounted, and Henry went through his pre-flight checks automatically, the training taking over. He checked the ammunition belts, made sure they fed smoothly, checked the recoil mechanism, the barrel, the sights, everything. Across from him on the port side, the other waist gunner, a veteran named Rodriguez who had 20 missions under his belt, watched him work. "You'll be fine, kid," Rodriguez said. "Just remember your training, and don't freeze up." Henry nodded, not trusting his voice. The engines coughed to life one by one, and a vibration shook through the entire airframe. It was a sound Henry would never forget, the deep, powerful rumble of 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines spinning up to full power. They taxied out to the runway, fell into formation with the other bombers, 11 planes total, and then it was time. Captain Thornton advanced the throttles, and Lucky Linda began her takeoff roll. The acceleration pressed Henry back against the bulkhead, and then they were airborne, climbing into the lightning sky, banking to the east toward New Guinea. The flight to the target took 2 hours, 2 hours of Henry standing at his gun, watching the ocean pass below, watching the other planes in formation, watching the sky for any sign of enemy fighters. Rodriguez tried to make small talk over the intercom, but Henry could barely focus on the words. His entire being was concentrated on the space around the plane, searching, always searching. They crossed the coastline, and Henry could see the jungle below, an unbroken carpet of green, and then mountains, and then the target area coming into view. The bombardier took over, guiding Captain Thornton toward the release point, and Henry could feel the plane steady out, flying straight and level. The worst possible situation for a bomber, because it made them a perfect target for anti-aircraft fire. The flak started almost immediately. Black puffs of smoke appeared in the sky around them, each one representing an 88mm shell exploding with enough force to rip a bomber apart. Lucky Linda shook from near misses, and Henry heard shrapnel pinging off the fuselage. Over the intercom, he could hear the bombardier counting down to release. 10 seconds. 9. 8. And then Rodriguez's voice, cutting through everything, high and tight with adrenaline. Fighters. 2 o'clock high. Multiple bandits. Henry swung his gun to the right and up, and that's when he saw them. Zeros. Not a handful. Not a few. Dozens of them. Diving down out of the sun like birds of prey, their wings sparkling with machine gun fire. This wasn't minimal opposition. This was a coordinated ambush. The Japanese pilots knew what they were doing. They came in from multiple angles simultaneously, making it impossible for the gunners to focus on any single threat. Henry saw a Zero lining up on the bomber to his right, saw the tracers reaching out, saw the B-17's engine burst into flame. Then there was no more time for watching. A Zero came straight at Lucky Linda from the starboard side, and Henry's training took over. He didn't think. He didn't panic. He just aimed, led the target, and squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber bucked in his hands, the sound deafening even through his headset, and he walked his tracers into the Zero's nose. He saw pieces fly off, saw the canopy shatter, saw the Zero snap roll and dive away trailing smoke. That was his first. He had maybe 3 seconds to process what he had just done before another Zero appeared, this one from below, coming up at them in a climbing attack. Henry traversed his gun down, fired another burst, and this one was even better. His round stitched across the Zero's fuselage, and it exploded, just came apart in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. That was his second. The attack lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. 20 minutes of constant, unrelenting combat, of Zeros swarming around formation like angry hornets, of bombers falling out of the sky, of men dying. Henry fired until his gun barrel was glowing red hot, until his shoulders ached from the recoil, until his ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear the intercom chatter. He lost count of how many Zeros he engaged. Rodriguez was shouting kill confirmations over the intercom. The ball turret gunner was screaming for more ammunition. The tail gunner was wounded but still firing. And through it all, Henry just kept shooting. A Zero came in from the beam. Henry fired. The Zero went down. Another from above. Henry tracked it, fired. The Zero exploded. Another head-on pass. Henry fired through the attacking fighter propeller arc, and the Zero flew right into a stream of bullets, disintegrating. By the time the Japanese fighters broke off the attack, running low on fuel and ammunition, Lucky Linda looked like she had been through a meat grinder. She had holes in both wings. One engine was out, the tail was shredded, and there was blood on the floor from the wounded tail gunner. But she was still flying, and her crew was alive. When they landed back at base, 3 hours later, Henry's hands were shaking so badly he could barely unbuckle his safety harness. He climbed out of the plane, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the cold at altitude. His legs almost gave out. Rodriguez caught him, held him up, and looked at him with something that might have been respect. The ground crew was already swarming over Lucky Linda, counting the holes, assessing the damage, and that's when the intelligence officer showed up with his clipboard, asking for kill confirmations. Rodriguez gave his account first. Said Henry had been on fire, had been shooting like a man possessed. The ball turret gunner confirmed multiple kills from Henry's position. The tail gunner, being helped to the infirmary, gave a weak thumbs up when Henry's name was mentioned. Captain Thornton, chewing his tobacco and looking 10 years older than he had that morning, clapped Henry on the shoulder and said one word: outstanding. The official count took 2 days to compile because they had to cross-reference observations from multiple crew members across the formation. When the numbers came back, Henry Christensen, farm boy from Nebraska, on his very first combat mission, had 8 confirmed kills. 8 Japanese fighters shot down in a single engagement. It was unprecedented. In the entire history of aerial combat up to that point, no gunner had ever achieved 8 kills on their first mission. Most gunners never achieved 8 kills in their entire tour of duty. The squadron commander didn't believe it at first, thought there had been some mistake. But the evidence was overwhelming. Gun camera footage from the bombers, testimony from a dozen different crew members, wreckage spotted on the ground by subsequent reconnaissance flights. All of it pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Henry Christensen was a natural, a prodigy, someone who possessed that rare combination of situational awareness, hand-eye coordination, mechanical aptitude, and sheer cold-blooded lethality that made for an exceptional warrior. The news spread through the base like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew who Henry was. Men who had been flying combat missions for months, men who had faced death dozens of times, looked at him with a mixture of awe and envy. Some thought he was lucky, that he had just been in the right place at the right time. Others thought he had some kind of gift, that he could see things other people couldn't. Henry didn't know what to think. He tried to process what happened, tried to remember every moment of that 20-minute span when he had taken 8 human lives, but all blurred together into a chaotic montage of images and sounds and sensations. He remembered the feel of the gun in his hands, the way the tracers arced through the sky, the way the Zeros exploded when his bullets found their mark. But he didn't remember making conscious decisions. It had all been instinct, reflex, training. That night, Henry wrote a letter home. He didn't tell his parents about the mission, didn't tell them about the kills, didn't tell them that he'd become, overnight, one of the most feared aerial gunners in the Pacific. He just told them he was okay, that he was doing his job, that he missed them in the farm and the smell of fresh-cut hay. He told them he loved them, He mailed the letter the next morning and wondered if they would ever know what he had become, what the war had made him. The next day, Captain Thornton told Henry that Lucky Linda was grounded for major repairs and that he was being temporarily reassigned to another crew, another B-17 called Hell's Fury, to fill in for a gunner who had been wounded. Henry packed his gear and reported to his new plane, and that's when he met Lieutenant Richard Wagner, a pilot from Pennsylvania who had a reputation for taking the toughest missions and somehow always bringing his crew home. Wagner looked at Henry's service record, looked at the 8 kills from his first mission, and raised an eyebrow. "I heard about you," Wagner said. "They're saying you're the best gunner in the squadron." Henry didn't know what to say to that, so he just shrugged. Wagner smiled, a thin, humorless smile. "Well, kid, you're about to earn that reputation, because we've got a mission tomorrow that's going to make your first one look like a Sunday picnic. We're hitting Rabaul." Henry's stomach dropped. Rabaul. Every man in the squadron knew about Rabaul. It was the most heavily defended Japanese position in the Pacific, a fortress built on the ruins of an Australian base, with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and dozens of fighter squadrons. Going to Rabaul was like walking into hell with a target painted on your back. The survival rate for bombers hitting Rabaul was less than 50%. The briefing for the Rabaul mission was grim. The intelligence officer laid out the target, a Japanese airfield and harbor complex, and showed them the defenses. The anti-aircraft artillery was concentrated in sectors, meaning they would have to fly through a gauntlet of flak just to reach the target. And the fighters, the major said, pausing for effect, expect at least 60 to 80 zeros in the air. The room went silent. 60 to 80. That was more than 4 times the number Henry had faced on his first mission. Lieutenant Wagner stood up, looked around at his crew and the other crews in the room, and said something that Henry would never forget. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we're going to kick the hornet's nest. Some of us won't be coming back. That's just the math. But for those of us who do come back, we're going to hurt them bad. We're going to show them that no matter how many fighters they throw at us, no matter how much flak they shoot, we're going to keep coming. Because that's what Americans do. We don't quit." The room erupted in applause, but Henry noticed that some of the men weren't clapping. They were just sitting there, staring at their hands, thinking about tomorrow. Henry didn't sleep that night either. He lay in his bunk listening to the sounds of men snoring, men praying, men crying quietly in the darkness. He thought about his first mission, about how surreal it had been, how detached he had felt from the violence, as if he were watching someone else pull the trigger. He wondered if tomorrow would be different, if the fear would finally catch up to him, if he would freeze when the zeros came. He thought about dying, really thought about it for the first time. What would it be like? Would it be quick? Would he feel pain? Would he have time to think about his family, about the farm, about all the things he would never do? Or would it just be a flash of light and then nothing? He didn't know. Nobody knew. That was the worst part. The not knowing. The morning came too fast. Henry went through the motions, the briefing, the walk out to Hell's Fury, the pre-flight checks. Everything felt heavy, like he was moving through water. The rest of the crew seemed to feel it too. Even Lieutenant Wagner, who was usually cracking jokes and keeping spirits up, was quiet and focused. They took off at 05:30, 18 bombers in total, and formed up over the ocean. The flight to Rabaul took 3 hours. 3 hours of Henry standing at his gun, watching the sky, waiting. The closer they got, the more the tension ratcheted up. Over the intercom, the radio operator reported that Japanese radio traffic was going crazy, that they knew the bombers were coming, that they were scrambling every available fighter. Henry's mouth went dry. This was it. This was the big one. They saw the fighters before they even reached the coast. Black dots in the distance, dozens of them, climbing to intercept. The formation tightened up, each bomber moving closer to its neighbors, presenting a wall of defensive firepower. And then the zeros were on them, and all hell broke loose. This attack was different from the first. The Japanese pilots were more aggressive, more coordinated, more desperate. They came in waves, attacking from every angle simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the bombers' defenses through sheer numbers. Henry saw a Zero make a head-on pass at Hell's Fury, saw the pilots face through the canopy for a split second, young and determined, and then Henry fired, and the Zero's engine disintegrated. Another Zero came from below. Henry traversed down and fired, saw his tracers punch through the fuselage, saw the Zero flip over and dive into the ocean. A third Zero attacked from the beam. Henry fired. The Zero exploded. His fourth, fifth, 6 kills of the day. But there were always more. For every Zero Henry shot down, 2 more took its place. The flak started as they approached the target, black clouds of death filling the sky, and Hell's Fury shuddered from near misses. Henry saw a bomber to his left take a direct hit, saw it fold in half like a piece of paper and drop out of the sky. 11 men gone in an instant. Another bomber's wing came off, and it spun down trailing flame and debris. The formation was being torn apart, but they pressed on, and then they were over the target, and the bombardier was releasing, and Henry felt the plane lurch upward as 6,000 pounds of bombs fell away. Now they just had to survive the flight home. The Zeros followed them for 40 minutes, harassing the formation, picking off stragglers, and Henry kept firing. He fired until his ammunition was almost gone, until his hands were blistered from the heat of the gun, until his vision blurred from exhaustion. He lost count of his kills. Rodriguez, who had been transferred to Hell's Fury as well, was screaming confirmations over the intercom, but Henry couldn't process the words. All he could do was keep shooting, keep fighting, keep surviving. When they finally crossed back over friendly territory and the Zeros turned back, Henry collapsed against the bulkhead. His legs wouldn't hold him anymore. His entire body was shaking, and he realized he was crying, tears streaming down his face, though he didn't know why. Relief? Fear? Grief for the men who hadn't made it back? All of it, probably. Rodriguez crawled over to him, put a hand on his shoulder, and said something Henry couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. When they landed, 6 bombers were missing, 6 crews, 66 men, dead or captured or lost in the ocean. Hell's Fury had made it back, but barely. She had so many holes in her that the ground crew chief said it would be easier to build a new plane than repair her. Lieutenant Wagner gathered his crew together on the tarmac, counted heads, and nodded once. "We made it," he said. "That's all that matters. We made it." The intelligence officer came around again with his clipboard, and the count started. This time, it took even longer because the action had been so chaotic, so intense, that it was hard to separate individual kills. But the evidence was there. Gun camera footage, testimony, observations from other planes. When the final tally came in, Henry had shot down 11 Japanese fighters over Rabaul. 11, combined with his 8 from the first mission. That gave him 19 confirmed kills in just 2 combat missions. 19. It was a number so extraordinary that the squadron commander had to report up the chain of command. Within a week, Henry's name was being mentioned in briefings at 5th Air Force headquarters. Within 2 weeks, war correspondents were asking to interview him. Within a month, he was being considered for the Medal of Honor. Henry hated the attention. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor, someone who had gotten lucky twice and was just waiting for his luck to run out. He saw the way other men looked at him, with that mixture of respect and fear, as if he were something other than human, something touched by death but immune to it. But he wasn't immune. He knew that. Every time he climbed into a bomber, every time it took off for another mission, he knew that this might be the one where his luck ended, where Zero's bullets found him, where a flak burst tore him apart. He started having nightmares, seeing the faces of the Japanese pilots he had killed, young men like him, men with families and dreams and hopes, all snuffed out by his bullets. He wondered if they had seen his face in that split second before they died, wondered if they had felt fear or anger or just surprise. He wondered if their families knew what had happened to them, if somewhere in Japan there was a mother waiting for a son who would never come home. But the war didn't care about Henry's doubts or his nightmares. The missions kept coming, one after another, and Henry kept flying because that was his job. That was what he'd signed up for. He flew 30 missions in total, and by the end of his tour, his confirmed kill count stood at 42. 42 Japanese fighters. He became the highest-scoring aerial gunner in the Pacific Theater, a record that would stand for the rest of the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and numerous other commendations. He was promoted to Staff Sergeant, then Technical Sergeant. He was offered promotion to officer in flight training, but he turned it down. He didn't want to be a pilot. He didn't want more responsibility, more men's lives depending on his decisions. He just wanted to do his job and survive. In late 1943, after completing his tour, Henry was sent back to the United States for a war bond tour. He traveled around the country, giving speeches, shaking hands, posing for photographs, telling sanitized versions of his combat experiences to crowds of civilians who had no idea what war really meant. He smiled for the cameras, said the right things, played the role of the heroic gunner. But inside he felt hollow. The war had changed him in ways he couldn't articulate, couldn't explain to people who hadn't been there. He felt disconnected from civilian life, from the concerns and complaints of people who worried about rationing and shortages while men were dying by the thousands in the Pacific and Europe. He felt like a ghost walking through a world he no longer belonged to. When the war bond tour ended, Henry requested to return to combat duty. His superiors thought he was crazy. He had done his part, more than his part. He could spend the rest of the war training new gunners, safe in the States, guaranteed to survive. But Henry didn't want safety. He wanted to be back with his crew, back where things made sense, back where his skills mattered. So they sent him back, reassigned him to the 306 Bombardment Group, which was now flying B-24s instead of B-17s, hitting targets deeper into Japanese-held territory. Henry flew another 15 missions, bringing his total to 45, and his kill count climbed to 48. But the war was changing. American forces were pushing the Japanese back, island by island, and air superiority was shifting. The desperate, chaotic dogfights of early 1942 were becoming less common. The missions were still dangerous, still deadly, but the odds were better now. America was winning. In August 1945, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war ended. Henry was in the Philippines when he heard the news. He was standing on the flight line, watching the sunset, thinking about nothing in particular, when someone ran up shouting that the Japanese had surrendered, that it was over. Henry's first reaction wasn't joy or relief. It was disbelief. How could it just be over? After all the blood, all the death, all the loss, how could it just end? But it had. The war was done, and now Henry had to figure out what came next. He was discharged in November 1945 with an honorable discharge and a chest full of medals. He went home to Nebraska, back to the farm, back to the life he had left 4 years earlier. But he wasn't the same person who had left. The farm seemed smaller somehow, the horizons closer. His parents were older, grayer, more fragile. His siblings had moved on with their lives, and there was a distance between him and them that hadn't been there before. They asked him about the war, about what he had done, and Henry gave vague answers. He couldn't tell them the truth. How could he explain what it felt like to kill 48 men? How could he describe the sound of a Zero exploding, the sight of a bomber spinning down in flames, the feeling of being so terrified that you couldn't breathe but still having to fight anyway? He couldn't, so he didn't try. Henry stayed on the farm for 6 months, helping his father with the work, trying to readjust to civilian life. But he couldn't sleep. The nightmares were worse now, more vivid, more frequent. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, seeing Zeros diving at him from the darkness. His hands would shake for hours afterward. He started drinking, just a little at first, enough to take the edge off, to help him sleep. But the drinking got worse. By the spring of 1946, Henry was drinking every night, sometimes starting in the afternoon. His father confronted him about it, and Henry exploded, said things he didn't mean, things he immediately regretted. His father looked at him with a sadness that was worse than anger, and Henry realized he was destroying himself, destroying his family. That's when Henry made another decision. He packed a bag, left a note for his parents saying he was sorry and that he needed to figure some things out, and he left. He drifted for a while, working odd jobs, moving from town to town, try to outrun the memories. He worked on construction crews, in factories, on ranches. He didn't talk about the war. He didn't tell anyone who he was or what he had done. He just worked, earned enough money to eat and sleep, and moved on. He met a woman in Colorado, a widow whose husband had been killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Her name was Margaret, And she understood loss in a way most people didn't. They started spending time together, and slowly, Henry began to feel human again. He told her about the war, about the missions, about the kills, about the guilt and the nightmares. She listened without judgment, and she told him that what he had done, what he had survived, didn't make him a monster. It made him a man who had been asked to do terrible things in a terrible time, and he had done them because someone had to. Henry and Margaret got married in 1947. They moved to Montana, bought a small ranch, and started over. Henry never flew again, never even wanted to. He raised cattle, fixed fences, planted crops. He had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and he was a good father, patient and kind but firm. He didn't talk about the war with his kids, not until they were adults and asked direct questions. Even then, he gave them only the broad strokes, the sanitized version. He never told them about the nightmares, which never completely went away, or the guilt, which he carried until the day he died. He joined the local VFW post, attended meetings, and found some measure of peace in the company of other men who understood what war cost. He lived a quiet life, a good life, far from the chaos and violence of his youth. Henry Christensen died in 1998 at the age of 77. He was buried in a small cemetery in Montana with full military honors. His Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, and Distinguished Flying Cross were displayed at his funeral, along with a photograph of him standing next to Lucky Linda, young and lean and unbroken. The obituary in the local paper mentioned that he'd been a decorated aerial gunner in World War II, but it didn't mention his record, didn't mention the 48 confirmed kills, didn't mention that first impossible day when a farm boy from Nebraska became one of the most lethal warriors in American history. His family knew, of course, and the veterans who came to his funeral knew. But to everyone else, Henry Christensen was just another old rancher, another quiet man who had lived a quiet life. But we know better, don't we? We know that Henry Christensen was extraordinary. We know that on December 7, 1941, the same day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, a door opened in his mind, and he walked through it into a world of violence and chaos and death. We know that on his very first combat mission, he achieved something that military historians still struggle to explain, shooting down 8 enemy fighters in a single engagement. We know that he went on to become the highest-scoring aerial gun in the Pacific Theater, that he flew 45 combat missions, that he stared death in the face dozens of times and never blinked. We know that he paid a price for that the war took something from him that he never got back, that he carried the weight of 48 lives for the rest of his days. We know that he was a hero, even though he never believed it himself. And that's the thing about heroes, isn't it? The real ones, the ones who actually do the extraordinary things. They don't think of themselves that way. They don't see themselves as special or gifted or blessed. They see themselves as ordinary people who were put in extraordinary circumstances and did what they had to do to survive, to protect their friends, to serve their country. Henry Christensen was a farmer who became a warrior, a boy who became a legend, a man who did the impossible and then spent the rest of his life trying to forget it. His story deserves to be remembered, deserves to be told, deserves to be honored, because stories like his are what built America, what saved America, what made America worth saving in the first place. So the next time you see an old veteran, the next time you pass by someone who served, remember that you have no idea what they've seen, what they've done, what they carry inside them. Remember that they might be heroes, real heroes, the kind who don't wear capes or seek glory, but who stood up when their country called and paid a price you can't imagine. Remember Henry Christensen, the farmer from Nebraska, who shot down 8 fighters on his first day in combat and became a legend. Remember what he did. Remember what he sacrificed. Remember that freedom isn't free, that someone always has to pay the bill, and that sometimes that someone is just a quiet farm boy with steady hands and a gift for making machines work. Remember. That's all we can do now. Remember and honor and never forget. If this story moved you, if Henry's sacrifice means something to you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These stories matter. These men and women matter. And as long as we keep telling their stories, as long as we keep remembering, they'll never truly be gone. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.